So, as Catherine was saying, it's likely to be the last party conference before the general election. It's really crucial for you. And at the Conservative conference last week, Rishi Sunak claimed he was the change candidate and that you would stick with the status quo. I'm sure you're going to disagree with that. But on behalf of our audience today, just to set out what we'd like to do is we really want to understand, for them, more about the changes that the country might expect if you become Prime Minister and how you might respond to Rishi Sunak. So let's start with a new policy that you're announcing today for the NHS in England. To get waiting lists down, you're going to ask doctors and nurses to volunteer to work overtime at weekends. They will be paid extra with the money coming in from your changes to the non-dom status. Aren't NHS staff already burned out, though?
They're working very hard, but let me just explain why we're doing this. Because economic growth has been very, very poor for 13 years. And everything you hear from Labour this week will be about the economy, about raising living standards across the whole of the country. One of the drags on that is the fact that 7.7 million people are on a waiting list. And everybody, I think, knows somebody, a relative, a friend, who's on a waiting list.
But what if doctors and nurses don't want to work weekends?
Well, there's the health implications of that, obviously, and there's then the drag on the economy. So far as our plan is concerned, it's for 2 million appointments every year, 40,000 a week, to be done out of hours, but paying staff properly to do it. Many of those staff are willing to do this. We have spoken to the staff, to staffing organisations and across the board, but it's a plan to actually bring down 2 million appointments every year, that waiting list. But desperately needed, and it'll be a huge boost for the economy.
Given some doctors are working in the private sector at the weekends, won't you actually have to change their contracts to make this happen?
You don't need to change the contracts for this because we will pay at the proper rates for out of hours.
More than they'd get in the private sector?
Well, this is to pay out of hours. Many of them
Is that more than they'd get in the private sector?
They will probably get more in the private sector, but we've seen examples...
So why are they going to switch then?
We've seen examples of this working in different parts of the country. We've talked to the NHS staff about this. It's a plan to take to get rid of the non-dom tax status. That's obviously the loophole that allows very rich people to avoid paying their tax in this country, and to use that money to pay for these extra hours and bring down the waiting list.
But you've just acknowledged that they do get paid more in the private sector, and I'm asking you, why then would a doctor or nurse switch from that higher pay to work for less at the weekends in the NHS to help you bring down the waiting list?
Because they want to bring down the waiting list as well.
But they also want to pay their bills.
There's a huge strain on the health service. My wife works for the NHS. I get a daily insight into the morale in our hospitals, in this particular one in London. They desperately want to bring down this waiting list. That's why we've talked to them. We're not going to impose this. It's a voluntary scheme. They're up for this. They're up for this because they know that bringing down their waiting list will reduce the pressure on them in the long run.
Right.
And we need to do this. We can't have... This is unprecedented. 7.7 million people on the waiting list.
It does sound like, essentially, you're going to rely on the goodwill of NHS staff to step up there.
We're going to pay them properly to do it. We're talking to them about it. They want to do this just as much as we do. Okay. And it is desperately needed. We need growth in our economy. We need to raise living standards across the country. We will never do that with the mess that this government's made of the NHS.
Let's talk about growth then. As I understand it, there isn't any extra money for public services if Labour win the next election. You've pledged that you're not going to borrow for day-to-day spending in the NHS and on schools, social care, other public services, because, as you've just said this morning a number of times, the way to fund the public services is through growth. If you don't get that growth, that means there will be no money, extra money for public services, correct?
I'm confident we can get the growth. That's why we have worked through a plan that tells you how we're going to get the growth, the people that we need, the skills that we need. We've set out a policy on skills just this morning to get the skills in the right area. The partnership with business, this is crucial. This will not be state control. It won't be pure free markets. It'll be a partnership with business. What businesses say to me is they need stability. They need that platform. There are plenty of investors who are absolutely clear in their discussions with me.
They
say we will invest in the UK if the circumstances are right, but at the moment, because of this government, there's too much chopping and changing of mind and chaos, and they're holding off for investment. We have to create the conditions for the growth in this country.
Let me come back to my question, if I may. If you don't get that growth, that means there'll be no extra money for public services.
I am confident that we will get that growth. It is
if you don't?
It is the single defining mission of an incoming Labour government. I've set out 5 missions, 5 purpose-driven things that we will go for over 5 and 10 years.
And one of them is the highest sustained growth in the G7.
It is the central one. It's not just one of them.
Okay.
It is the central mission
of
the incoming Labour government. Because everything else hangs off that.
Absolutely. And I'm asking, what if you don't get it?
I'm confident that we will. That's why we've worked so hard.
Confident? That's like crossing your fingers.
No, it's not. That's what the government's been doing. I'm confident because we've got a strategic plan. I'm confident because I've listened to businesses who say to me, these are the impediments in my way. I've said to businesses, look, infrastructure, how long would it take you, for example, to build a wind farm? I'm told about 2 years physically, but about 13 years before we actually get any power out of it. That means we've got to go at pace to deal with the planning that sits in the way of it. We've got to go at pace to deal with the grid, which is far too slow. So my confidence comes not from coming on here and simply asserting it this Sunday morning, but because of months and years of careful conversations with those that will be delivering this with us. I'm absolutely confident that with the right strategy in place, with the right foundation in place, we can do what we need to do, which is grow the economy.
And how long will it take?
Well, we think we can start this straight away. I mean,
but how soon do you expect to see higher growth than we've had, say, in the last 10 years?
Very quickly.
And investment in public services?
Very quickly under a Labour government.
Like a year? 2 years? 3 years? What?
Some of the change that we need to make can be done very quickly.
Right, so when would you expect that to lead through to growth and therefore more money for public services?
Take planning. We can deal with that very, very quickly.
Could you answer the question, please, first?
We think that this can happen very quickly. Within months of a Labour government turning in, we can turn this around and get the investment that we need. Investors are ready to join us in this venture. They are holding off at the moment because of the instability. I want to ensure that our country is no longer held back and can move forward under growth. One more thing about growth that is really important.
Briefly, please.
We don't just... everybody, in a sense, wants growth. You need a strategy and a plan. But we want growth across the whole of the country. So not just growth in London and the South East and redistribution as a one-word plan for the rest of the country, growth everywhere. And that's why, in addition to businesses, we've been talking to our local mayors about economic hubs and how we drive this across the whole of the United Kingdom.
Can I just put this to you? Growth, including productivity growth, has been slowing across much of the developed world since about 2005. It's not just a feature of the Conservative government here in the UK. So are you claiming that the UK, under a Labour government, can somehow buck this global trend?
Yes, and I'll tell you for why. One looking back, one looking forward. If you look at growth under the last Labour government, if we had had growth at the same rate as we had under the last Labour government...
Totally different circumstances.
Hear me out, please. If we had had growth in the last 13 years at the same rate as we've had growth under this failed government, then we would have tens of billions of pounds to spend on our public services. Looking forward, the race is on for the next generation of jobs. You can see that in America with the Inflation Reduction Act, which is like a magnet for investment. The EU has got a response to that. Our government is sitting on its hands. The race is on. We should be in that race. I am confident, talking to our partners, that we can get ahead in that race and we can be the winners for the next generation of jobs. But we will not get there by sitting on our hands. We will not get there by being defeatist about it. We will get there through hard work, a strategic plan, work through with our partners, knowing the people that we need in place, with the skills in place, the investment that we need, and a government prepared to be active and take the tough decisions to ensure this happens.
Let's move on to housing. Huge issue for so many people watching right now. It's not one of your 5 missions. Why, given the scale of the problem?
Well, it is within the mission, which is about opportunity. So we've got 5 missions. Obviously, growing the economy is the number one, and this is relevant to housing, of course. But another of the missions is about opportunity, breaking the class ceiling. That's about education skills, but it's also about housing, because we don't build enough houses. The dream of home ownership has been completely shattered under this government. We need to turn that around, partly obviously for the individuals and families who desperately need a secure home, a roof over their head, but also because it drives economy. If you're a business and those that you might employ can't afford to live near where your business is unlikely to take off. So this is also about growth.
Right. Yesterday, your deputy described it as a Tory housing crisis and said Labour would increase affordable homes by getting tough on developers and reforming the planning laws. How many houses need to be built each year, would you say, to fix the housing crisis?
I think about, our aspiration would be over a 5-year period to get to 1.5 million.
Right, so what's that every year? Do the maths for me.
Well, that's 250,000 or just over 300,000 a year. But we need to get to 1.5 million. But we can't just pluck a figure because every political party plucks a figure. We need to understand.
You've just plucked a figure.
Yes, but that won't happen unless you take the steps that we are setting out.
OK. And let me tell you that the Centre for Cities say ending the housing crisis in the next 25 years would require England to add 442,000 homes every year.
Yes. Well, look...
So that's almost...
No, it's not.
Third more than you are suggesting.
We can argue about the figures, but it's not a million miles from what we're saying. But look, talking about it isn't going to achieve it. What's happened under this government is they've taken the targets down. That's because Rishi Sunak was too weak to stand up to his own backbenchers. But is this your
new target then? So 300,000?
We put the targets back up to get building happening. We have to challenge the planning laws. We have to get real about where we're going to build, and we have to work with developers to get there at speed. Okay. This can be done, but it will never be done by a government that simply takes down targets because the Prime Minister is too weak to stand up to his own party.
And just so our audience is clear, are you saying your target is going to be 300,000 a year?
I'm saying 1.5 million houses over the 5 years, I hope, of an incoming Labour government.
OK. Social housing specifically, let's talk about that. The National Housing Federation says 90,000 social homes a year are needed. How will you make sure that figure, if not more, are built?
Well, I think here we have to work with local authorities who are the drivers of social housing because we do need this affordable housing. At the moment what happens, I've seen this for myself in Camden, is that local authorities can use a procedure, slightly technical, Section 106 notices, to leverage in social housing with developers as they build in any given area. We need to strengthen that and make it more robust to ensure that that social housing, that affordable housing, is part of the development across the whole country. In some areas it's being done really well, in other areas not so much, but we need to drive. So we've got the house building in its own right as a project, this alongside it for affordable houses.
And if developers say to you, look, what you're suggesting is actually not financially viable, you risk no affordable houses being built.
Well, what happens in practice is that developers say it is viable when they seek the permission in the first place, and then later on say that the circumstances have changed and it's no longer viable. We need to strengthen the guidance, strengthen the framework to ensure that that doesn't happen.
Why is that going to make developers build affordable housing?
Well, the way the process works is that for permission to be given, you have a 106 process, which means it is conditional on social housing.
Yes.
Therefore, you can build conditional on the social housing.
Yes.
We need to make sure that that contract holds. What happens in practice is the contract is made and over time it yields and they're not held to it. We need to hold them to it.
And how will you hold them to it?
Well, that is about the statutory framework. That is about the guidance.
So they'd be breaking the law if they didn't do it?
Well, what happens in practice is there's agreement is made.
No, but what would you do?
The agreement is made, it's challenged, it then usually ends up in court because there isn't clarity about the guidance. So if we can crack, that is where these projects fall down. And if we can crack that, we can crack on with social housing and affordable housing.
But it sounds like if you make the guidance clearer, suddenly private developers are going to be...
stronger, more robust. I can tell you...
And if they still don't do it, what will you do?
I've seen this myself.
And I'm asking you what you'd do if the developers say, look, it's just not financially viable. What will you actually do?
Well, the whole contract falls then and they can't build at all. So that is not a good place for them to end up in.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? So there'll be no houses built at all.
The problem is it breaks down further down the line ends up in court, and we need to stop that happening. But, you know, it is technical stuff, but it is the single biggest problem in building that social housing. And what just to give confidence in this, there are some places, some authorities, where this is working really well. It's just not working everywhere, and we want to make sure it is working everywhere.
You have described yourself as a pragmatist in the past. You said you made a pragmatic decision to abandon some pledges when you were trying to become leader, like bringing rail, mail, energy and water into common ownership. With that in mind, tomorrow the Supreme Court begins a hearing into whether the government's plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda is legal. You've made it clear you oppose the policy because you don't think it will work. If the Supreme Court rules it is legal and flights to Rwanda begin to take off and the numbers crossing the channel on small boats decline, i.e., so it's working, would you still reverse it?
Yes.
Why?
I think it's the wrong policy. It's hugely expensive. It's a tiny number of individuals who would go to Rwanda. And the real problem is at source.
So even if everybody can see it's working, the criminal gangs are declining, fewer people are getting in those boats, fewer people are drowning, you would still reverse it, even if it was working?
Putting this to me on the basis that it's working. We've been told by the government time and again that what they're saying, even saying that they've got a Rwanda scheme, will reduce the numbers. That hasn't happened.
If you say you're a pragmatist and you can see it's working, you're telling our audience now you'd still reverse it.
Let me tell you pragmatically what I do about this issue, because nobody wants to see these crossings across the channel. They will only stop if we smash the criminal gangs who are running this vile trade. Now, before I was a politician, I was Director of Public Prosecutions for 5 years, and that meant I worked with other countries coordinating a plan to smash terrorist gangs, to smash gangs that were people smuggling. Those boats that are being used now across the channel are being made to order. They're being transported across by gangs to the northern coast of France, and people making millions of pounds are putting people in that boat. We have to break that. I am convinced we can. I've seen it happen, and we start there, because you don't start by what are you going to do at the end of the process when you've failed to control your borders. You start by controlling your borders. You've then also got to process the claims, because I think most people would be shocked to learn that of all the people that arrived by small boat in the last year or so, 1% have had their claims processed. So no wonder we've got, at the taxpayers' expense, lots and lots of people in hotel accommodation causing this problem. As a pragmatist, I want a pragmatic plan that is actually going to fix this problem, not rhetoric, which has got this government absolutely nowhere.
I don't know if you've seen, but if you've been watching this programme in the last few weeks, you will have seen other leaders have been shown research by the organisation More in Common, asking people to say in one or two words what they think each party leader stands for. I have seen that. You have? What do you hope they said about you?
Look, I don't know, but I think
what do you hope they say about you?
Yeah, I think you're about to tell me.
Well, go on. What do you hope they say about you?
Well, look, we've got an incredible week this week to set out our stall.
OK.
And that gives us the chance.
Let's have a look at it. Let's have a look. So, there's nothing, don't know, working class, Labour, himself, not sure, Labour Party, equality, fairness. How do you feel about that?
I've had a lot worse thrown at me in my life. But look, if you take, I can see don't know in there.
And nothing. You stand for nothing. Yeah. The question is, what do you think Sir Keir Starmer stands for?
Yeah.
Nothing.
Well, that is why this week is so important for us. We come here to this, the last conference before a general election, to set out our positive case. I've been very clear about my job, which was to take over the Labour Party and take us from the worst general election loss since 1935, that was our last general election, to a Labour Party that can win the general election. That required me to be disciplined, to change the party at speed and ruthlessly, to expose both the Tories and the SNP in Scotland as not fit to govern, and then to set out and answer the question, if not them, then why us? So we're bang on schedule. We've already set out in 5 missions what we're going to do, so we've already answered that question. What we need to do here in Liverpool is bring it together, to weld together, if you like, the reassurance that people need in times like this, with the hope that they want, built on top of that for not just fixing the problems, but taking our country forward.
Finally, last week, Laura asked Rishi Sunak what he admires about you. What do you admire about Rishi Sunak?
I admire the fact that on the day he was elected Prime Minister, he made a point of phoning me for a one-to-one conversation. And in that conversation, we agreed that we would, challenge each other robustly on the things that we needed to challenge each other on. But when it came to national security and to terrorism, we would stand together. And I admire that. I think it was the right thing to do. I think for a Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition to say there are some things of such national importance that we will work together and stand together is good for our country. So I admire that.
Thank you very much for talking to us this morning. Sir Keir Starmer.